October 14th, 1943. 25,000 feet over enemy territory. Your world is a plexiglass cage, smaller than a coffin. Your hands are on two .50 caliber machine guns that combined weigh more than you do.
And then you see it, a Focke-Wulf 190, positioning itself at 6 o'clock low, the most vulnerable angle, the kill shot position. You swing the guns, trying to aim with a primitive ring and bead sight, basically two metal posts. No velocity compensation, no deflection calculation.
Your bomber is a stable gun platform. The fighter isn't. At a closing speed of over 150 miles per hour, you're trying to hit a target the size of a car that's jinking and weaving. It's an impossible shot.
The scene, Staff Sergeant Charlie Smith just survived, was repeated 291 times that day. It was the second raid on the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt. 291 B-17s were sent deep into Germany, crucially without fighter escort. By nightfall, 60 bombers were shot down, over 20% of the force. Another 138 returned so damaged they would never fly again. 600 American airmen were killed.
The math was brutal. At that loss rate, no crew would statistically survive their 25 mandatory missions. Post-mission analysis revealed the dark truth. The tail gunners, the last line of defense, had a hit rate below 8%. German pilots knew this. They only needed to attack from the rear, endure a few seconds of inaccurate fire, and they could dismantle the entire American bombing campaign.
The crisis was immediate. At the 8th Air Force HQ in High Wycombe, commanders were faced with a terrifying reality. The defensive armament of the Flying Fortress was on the verge of being canceled. And in the face of this crisis, one of the great hangar stories of the 8th Air Force was born. A legend.
Right. It's a story that's been told in barracks and pubs for decades. The names and dates get fuzzy, lost in the fog of war, but the truth of it is solid. It's the story of a single, anonymous gunner who decided he'd had enough. For our investigation, we're just going to call him Sergeant Charlie Smith.
Exactly, which is why, for this investigation, we're taking a different approach. We're treating this legend like a historical case file. We will reconstruct the narrative based on the most common telling of the story, and then, at the end, separate the legend from the documented facts. The story is about this single, anonymous gunner, a 22-year-old with little formal education who was about to sketch a design that would triple gunner accuracy and save thousands of lives. This is the story of the innovation they tried to ban. The B-17's defensive philosophy was borrowed from naval warfare. It was designed as a flying warship with interlocking fields of fire. But that was the promotional angle. The reality was far more brutal.
The man in the tail was Charlie Smith, from Pittsburgh, a former factory worker with no engineering training, who enlisted at 19 after Pearl Harbor. Like thousands of other young men, he was given 6 weeks of training and then thrown into the deadliest air campaign in history. His office, 5 miles up, wasn't much bigger than a coffin. He wasn't sitting, wasn't standing. He was kneeling on something like an ironing board, set at 2 different levels, wrestling with 2 Browning M2 machine guns. At 84 pounds each, the guns alone were a nightmare to maneuver in that tiny space.
He was expected to perform impossible calculations in a split second. Estimate the enemy's relative velocity, the deflection angle, bullet drop, all while wearing thick gloves in minus 40-degree temperatures. All while the German cannons, with their superior effective range, could open fire long before his own machine guns could hope to connect. Under controlled, perfect conditions, gunner hit rates barely exceeded 12%. In the chaos of combat, that dropped to 8.
The Luftwaffe pilots called the tail gun position marginally dangerous. Their tactic was simple: attack from 6 o'clock, absorb 15 seconds of wild fire, and punch through from 200 yards. It worked every time.
And inside the bomber, communication was a frantic ballet. The intercom was always live. One gunner would spot a threat and shout a warning to the others. "Charlie's coming your way." A call out echoing through the headsets as another fighter peeled off for an attack run. The period became known as Black Week. The losses were staggering. 60 bombers at Schweinfurt on August 17th, 30 over Bremen on October 8th, another 30 over Munster 2 days later. In Washington, a furious General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Air Forces, cabled his commanders in England, demanding answers, questioning if the entire campaign was strategically feasible. The official solution was coming, but it was slow. Engineers proposed larger weapons, motorized turrets. Boeing's Cheyenne Modification Center was already designing one, but the deadline stretched well into 1944. Worse, installation required months of factory modifications, an impossible task for the overworked ground crews in England.
A motorized turret in 1944. Fantastic news for the crews flying in 1943. I'm sure they were thrilled to hear that help was on the way. They just had to try not to die for another 18 months. On his first mission, August 19th, Smith fired 480 rounds and didn't get a single hit. The physical exhaustion of wrestling the guns in the freezing cold was immense. The psychological frustration was worse. The breaking point came when he watched his best friend's bomber get taken apart by a fighter that came in from the tail, unopposed. It was after that mission, sitting in the quiet of his grounded gunner station, stewing in anger and grief, that he had the Eureka Moment. He saw the reflection of a ground vehicle in the curved plexiglass and noticed it created a ghost image that tracked perfectly ahead of the real target. The idea was born. Use a simple reflective sight combined with mirrors for peripheral vision to let the ghost image do the impossible math for you.
The technology itself wasn't science fiction. Reflector gun sights already existed on American fighter planes, like the P-47 Thunderbolt. The genius, and the crime, was not in inventing it, but in the idea that a grunt could steal one and make it work where the engineers hadn't. And the Army Air Forces took that very seriously. Smith knew his idea violated a host of technical orders, which strictly forbade unauthorized modifications to defensive armament. On paper, what Smith was about to do wasn't just illegal, it was an act of sabotage that could get him court-martialed.
Of course, there was a specific regulation against it. The Army has a rule for everything, including, apparently, a rule against unauthorized battlefield survival. His decision was simple. He didn't care. He found Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman, a 38-year-old from Detroit with a knack for improvisation. The conversation was short. "This is illegal," Kellerman said. Smith replied, "Yes, Sergeant." Kellerman asked, "When are you flying again?" "Tomorrow." "Then we'd better get to work, quick." They worked all night, under a single bare bulb in Kellerman's workshop. The materials were a testament to battlefield ingenuity. Sheet metal was recovered from wrecked aircraft, mirrors were scrounged from damaged navigation equipment, and the crucial reflector sight was cannibalized from the cockpit of a destroyed P-47 Thunderbolt. They installed it on the B-17G, nicknamed Knockout Dropper. The very next day, on a mission to Munster, Smith used the sight to shoot down a Messerschmitt Bf-109. The celebration on the tarmac lasted exactly 20 minutes, until the crew chief, Master Sergeant Donald Pierce, spotted the unauthorized gear. The arrival of the base engineering officer, Captain Richard Voss, was swift and furious. Citing regulations chapter and verse, he threatened Smith with a court-martial on the spot before the bomber's pilot, Lieutenant Robert Holbrook, stepped in to defend his gunner. You have to wonder what was going through Voss's head. "Congratulations on not dying, Sergeant. Now let's talk about your violation of paragraph 7, subsection B."
The news spread like wildfire, dividing the base. On one side was Captain Voss and the bureaucracy, arguing that unauthorized modifications compromised discipline and safety. An army runs on regulations, and if you let one sergeant bend the rules, the whole system could collapse. On the other side were the combat crews, arguing that the regulations were getting them killed. An emergency meeting was called. Major William Calhoun, defending Smith, ended the shouting match with a simple demand: then test it. The impasse went up the chain of command, finally landing on the desk of Colonel Stanley Ray. Ray was 53, a World War I veteran who had seen the difference between smart rules and dumb ones. He listened to the arguments from both sides for 90 minutes.
Then he asked two logical questions. How many bombers did we lose last week? The answer was 17. How many fighters did our tail gunners shoot down? The answer was 3. He made a pragmatic decision. He authorized a 3-mission test of Smith's sight. His final order? Let someone bring me a set of those damn mirror drawings. All right, this is where the rubber meets the road. So we have to turn it over to the Legion. If you were in Colonel Ray's place, with lives on one side and regulations on the other, would you have taken the same risk and broken the rules?
The first test mission was to Bremen on October 12th. The results were staggering. 2 confirmed kills, 1 probable. Ammunition expenditure was 190 rounds per kill. The previous average was over 2,800. Even the skeptical Captain Morrison had to admit it works.
But official adoption would take 6 weeks to push through the bureaucracy. Colonel Ray didn't wait. He walked up to Kellerman and said, "Start building." They set up a makeshift manufacturing operation in a spare hangar.
By October 20th, 18 bombers were secretly equipped with the Smith sight. The data that flowed back to Colonel Ray's office was undeniable. On a mission to Duran, the hit rate jumped to 23.4%. Over Wilhelmshaven, 23.5%. Gelsenkirchen, 21.8%. This wasn't a fluke, it was a revolution. But the ultimate validation came from the enemy. Allied intelligence in London intercepted and decrypted a German high command report. It quoted the diary of Luftwaffe ace Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, who warned his fellow pilots that the flying fortresses have become significantly more dangerous, and concluded that attacks from the rear now carry unacceptable risk. The German strategy had been broken. On November 18th, Brigadier General Frederick Castle visited the base. He asked Smith if he knew his invention was illegal. Smith's response, "I didn't know, sir, but the old sights definitely didn't work." Castle authorized it on the spot. It was given the official designation Field Expedient Tailgun Aiming System Type 1.
So after all that, they couldn't just call it the Smith sight? They had to give it a name so boring no one would ever suspect it was invented by an actual human being who had been shot at.
And here, the legend attributes a stunning legacy to the Smith sight. The story claims it led to a 35% reduction from tail attacks, and that post-war analysis credited it with saving 8,400 crewmen. Now, to be clear, historians would rightly point out that this period also saw the widespread arrival of the P-51 Mustang, the long-range fighter escort that changed the entire air war. Attributing all those saved lives to one invention is impossible.
But even with Mustangs in the sky, the dogfights still happened. And in those close-quarters knife fights, a gunner who could put rounds on target faster made a life-or-death difference.
Exactly. The precise numbers may be lost to the legend, but the principle is sound. The innovation worked, and it gave the men in the tail a fighting chance they didn't have before.
Smith himself would be credited with 7 kills, a remarkable number for any gunner. But shortly after his invention was standardized, his own plane was shot down over Germany. He spent the rest of the war in the brutal Stalag 17 POW camp. When he was finally liberated, weighing less than 100 pounds, he just went home. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his combat record, but the official citation carefully and deliberately avoided the word illegal. He refused all publicity and interviews. He went back to Pittsburgh, married his sweetheart, and worked for 37 years as a quiet, unassuming machinist. At a reunion in 1983, a former pilot named Gerald Hammond found him and said, "Because of you and those mirrors, I came home." Smith just nodded quietly. When he died in 2003, his obituary was a single line in a local paper.
Whether Sergeant Charlie Smith existed exactly as the legend describes him, with every line of dialogue and every victory, we'll never know for sure. There are no official records of his illegal gunsight, but what we do know for certain is that men like him existed, anonymous. Mechanics and gunners all across England who were bending the rules, modifying their planes with scrap parts, fighting their own private wars against both the enemy and a system that was too slow to save them.
And we know that real heroes with real names paid the ultimate price in that seat. Men like the actual Sergeant Michael Romano, a tail gunner with the 398th Bomb Group, who was killed in action over France in 1944. In the end, the legend of Sergeant Charlie Smith isn't about one man. It's a tribute to all of them. It's a tribute to the ingenuity of the Grunt and the sacrifice of the men who never came home.
The story of Sergeant Charlie Smith is the perfect example of bottom-up innovation. But while he was solving one deadly problem in the tail of a B-17, the generals in the Pacific were facing a much bigger one, the catastrophic failure of the entire B-29 Superfortress program. The man they sent to fix it had a very different and far more brutal definition of the solution.
Right. Sergeant Charlie Smith was a guy who broke the rules to save his friends. The man in our next case file, General Curtis LeMay, rewrote the rule book of war itself. When his billion-dollar bombers kept failing, he unleashed a man-made hurricane of fire on Tokyo, killing over 100,000 people in a single night.
It was called Operation Meetinghouse, and it was the night the Second World War changed forever. That's our next case file, and you can watch it by clicking the link on your screen now.